Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all. From those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video. Looking today at the Canterbury Tales, written by Geoffrey Chaucer in the late 14th century. Taking quotes, lines, and general markers from Chaucer's seminal work and placing them within the real world, the real life locations that would have been mentioned by Chaucer in the late 14th century. This is the second half to my two-part special on the Canterbury Tales. And the only thing that you need to know for this video in terms of what happened in part one is that Geoffrey Chaucer's pilgrims started from the Tabard Inn in the London borough of Southwark and have made their way halfway to the city of Rochester, its own pilgrim site, thanks to the saintly figure of William of Perth. But it's after the city of Rochester that we find ourselves in a bit of a problem. Not because of the real-world locations, which still exist and have a rich abundance of cultural history behind them. And it's not even to do with the text itself, which, despite at times being somewhat vague and maybe lacking in a lot of details, it's still the Canterbury Tales, and it's still a good read. It is, in fact, actually the route in which a modern pilgrim would take to Canterbury compared to Geoffrey Chaucer's route. What was, and still is, a major route from London through to Canterbury and towards the port of Dover, that would have had a number of walkers and horses, carriages, tradespeople, diplomats, all sorts of people using that route, has now in the modern day been tarmacked, with the majority of its use being for vehicles. So of course, the Canterbury Way cannot now service these walkers that wish to recreate Chaucer's great work and maybe pilgrimage themselves spiritually towards Canterbury Cathedral. So an alternative route that follows the Kentish Downs and the Surrey Hills has been placed in its stead. But it doesn't exactly follow that original route, but it is as close as it can be. So the Canterbury Way and the Canterbury Tales can be followed from London to Rochester, diverted off following thus, and then rejoining just before you reach the city of Canterbury, at a place called Harbledown, which is our next real-life stop and location.
Know you not where there is a little town, which is called Bob Up and Down? Under the Bleen, on the Canterbury Way, did our host begin to joke and play.
Now this quote doesn't necessarily mean that this Bob Up and Down is the same Harbledown that we see today. But it is what is said around that quote that is interesting. It is said that Bob Up and Down is on the Canterbury Way underneath the Bleen. Now looking at our Ordnance Survey map, we can see the town of Harbledown. And if we follow sort of a northerly direction above Harbledown, we get to Bleen, which is a small township, probably about half an hour's walk from Harbledown. And actually, this green space nature reserve is also called the Bleen Woods. So whether Chaucer was talking about the township of Bleen, or whether he was talking about the Bleen Woods, 6 6.5. So we definitely know that Chaucer is mentioning Harbledown in his Canterbury Tales.
Now, most of the present-day buildings constructed within Harbledown today are roughly around 200 to 300 years old, dating between the 18th and 19th centuries. But there are a couple of landmarks within Harbledown which date to the time of Geoffrey Chaucer. In fact, they date to the time of Thomas à Becket himself, and even as far back as the Norman Conquest. Those are the Church of St. Nicholas, which also serves as a chantry and a hospital for lepers that was built in 1084. And then the parish church of St. Michael and All Saints, which was constructed in roughly the mid to late 12th century.
St. Nicholas Church and its adjacent hospital would have serviced those suffering from leprosy, a rather debilitating skin and nerve-ending condition which, left untreated, can cause, well, lasting damage. In the modern day, it can be easily treated with a number of medications. Unfortunately, during the medieval period, despite the fact that leprosy was a somewhat rare condition to have, it was associated with people who were sinful, and that these individuals were being punished for acting in a sinful way. These leprosy sufferers were forced to ring a bell wherever they went, to wear a cloak to hide their disfigurement. They were considered the living dead, and that their simple breath could create a miasma that would infect other people. They were booted out of city limits and town limits and made to live isolated from the rest of society in these hospitals. But following the middle 1300s and the conclusion to the Black Death, this perilous disease that killed nearly half of Europe's population at the time, the numbers of people suffering from leprosy plummeted significantly. I mean, really, it's no surprise. There was barely anyone left, and most people had died of the Black Death. So, the church and its next door hospital decided to service people who were suffering from TB, tuberculosis, as well. So at the time of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, towards the end of the 1300s, this hospital wasn't mostly filled with leprosy sufferers, but probably those, again, suffering from TB.
The story of the Manciple had ended. From the south line the sun had now descended. So low it stood, so far as I had sight, at less than 29 degrees in height. 4 o'clock it was, to make a guess. 11 foot long, or little more or less, my shadow was, as at that time and place, measuring feet by taking in this case. My height at 6 foot, divided in like pattern, proportionally, and the power of Saturn began to rise with Libra just as we approached a little thorpe. Following the Manciple's tale, the readers are told that the pilgrims approached the next village along the Canterbury Way, when the sun was at roughly 29 degrees in height. Now, unfortunately, in the distance here, this little point that I am poking to here, that is Canterbury Cathedral. So, as to what village Chaucer was mentioning, it is unclear. And the Parson's Tale, which is the following story on from the Manciple, is the final tale of the Canterbury Tales that Chaucer wrote. Only 24 stories out of the approximate 100 to 120 were actually written by Chaucer before he died in 1400.
So let's now take a final look at our Ordnance Survey map, this time at the city of Canterbury itself. Now, looking at our Ordnance Survey map, we see the town of Harbledown, and we see the very central area of Canterbury, to the right-hand side there, Canterbury Cathedral. Now, in between these 2 points here is probably about a half an hour's worth of walking. We can see that actually there is a small little place in between these 2 points of Harbledown and Canterbury Cathedral, and that is St. Dunstan's. This place which would have been on the outskirts of Canterbury itself hundreds of years past. So perhaps St. Dunstan, which has its own St. Dunstan's church, would be this small village that Chaucer mentioned in his Parson's Tale, when the sun was at 29 degrees, 4 p.m. exactly. And so, although it is never explicitly mentioned in the tales, Geoffrey Chaucer's pilgrims would have next made their way to Canterbury Cathedral. They would have partaken in Mass and the other ceremonies that associated with pilgrimage, and then they would have made their return journey back to the Tabard Inn. We don't know who won that storytelling competition that the host set out at the very start of these Canterbury Tales. Maybe if you ever decide to read some of these tales yourselves, you could maybe conclude which story you found the best, maybe the most amusing, maybe the most exciting. Thank you for watching this video about Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and looking at some of the historical sites that Chaucer mentions within his tales, the real histories behind those towns and villages that are mentioned. Thank you for watching, and I shall see you in another video some point soon. See you later.